First, today I watched a couple videos by a series called Japanology. The host, ironically, appeared to be half English, half Japanese. He had a British accent, but he clearly loved Japan and was spending a lot of time in Japan. It was about really strange things that we don't really think to make documentaries about in Western culture. This documentary series was, it zoomed in on really interesting little aspects that tended to show what animism in a strong ethnoculture is all about. And watching this, I just got this deep impression about how being isolated on their island really preserved and protected Japanese ethnoculture. And not only that, but how deeply tied and bonded these people are to their landscape. So one of the documentaries was on moss, and the other one was on snow. You know how they always say when they're talking about psychic stuff and like past lives, or even like astral projection, when you're a child and you're out in your backyard and you have that sort of leisure time to just spend time in your backyard, and I don't know, it brings me back, and I remember like laying in the grass and looking like really closely at the grass, picking a blade of grass and looking at like the fibers in it and like the little patterns of the veins in the blade of grass and the little creatures that are walking on the blade of grass, and like the whole little village of life that you find in any like square inch of grass. I think that's just more testament to how animism is natural. And as children, when we're left to sort of wander as free-range children in your backyard alone without anybody telling you what to do, how to think, how to organize your time, you fall into just very natural animistic ways. How the Japanese don't lose this sense as they grow up. When I was looking at how their buildings fit in their landscape and how their island has such a distinct flavor to it, and the people fit in that landscape so perfectly, and the buildings themselves fit so perfectly in that landscape, I became very overwhelmed with emotion about the isles that my ancestors come from. It's interesting because we look at Japan and we think, wow, what beauty, what interesting architecture. Look at how the architecture fits with the plant life and the mountains, or, you know, the specific ecosystem that they have over there, and the people. And so thinking about how the Japanese people are so in tune with their surroundings. If you actually know anything about the British Isles, whether you're talking about Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, the outlying islands, or whatever, these are people who also are very, very rooted in their ethnoculture. I mean, in their landscape. One of the things that stood out to me during my time in the UK was how everyone seemed to know so much about their own landscape that we in America don't. And it's weird. It's a shame. It's like, why is that? Like, most people in America, unless you had a really good parent or grandparent that really taught you, or if you were like in Boy Scouts or something, a lot of people in America can't walk through a forest and name all the species. Like the species of, I mean, we know like the major birds. I mean, we could name a cardinal because it's obvious, a blue jay because it's obvious, a robin because they're so common. But there's a whole lot of birds that are just sort of like, they fly around, they're sort of average looking, they don't stand out, and we don't really pay attention. Or like species of snakes that are local, or even like bird sounds. to be able to identify various bird calls. Like, we're just, in America, a lot of people are just not that deeply grounded in our own ethnoculture, which is a really sad thing. It got me thinking also, these islands. I mean, the Japanese tend to be rather fair-skinned compared to other Asian islanders, like Polynesians or Southeast Asians, just due to the climate. But, it did get me thinking about, like, the Scandinavians, and it's more of a peninsula, but it's, for all intents and purposes, that is kind of like an island culture. Because Scandinavia is, like, mostly edged out by water on almost all sides. In a way, it's kind of unfair that people look at Japan and notice how in tune they are with their culture, thinking that the white man is not. Moving forward in time, materialism and consumerism has done that, which goes hand in hand with Christianity. But a heck of a lot of Americans are very disconnected from their landscape, and it's probably due to the purposeful severing of us from culture and from being bound to the land, tied to the land, connected to the land. So liberals will talk about migration and immigration, and it's really shocking to hear people talk about Great Britain as a land of migration, a country of migration. And migration is what built this nation and made it strong. A long tradition of immigration. It's crazy to me because this is the same messaging that I was given as a kid in America. And it seemed to make more sense for us in America. But even here, it's been twisted and perverted and changed. And our entire country has been completely twisted and perverted and changed from what it once was. So in America, you have all of these kids who talk about what their ancestry is, where their family comes from. And we understand that our family came from somewhere to build this nation. And this is why I look a certain way, because of my ancestral heritage and where my ancestors came from. So another thing about these islands, there is an argument that the Anglo-Saxons were always in Britain. They were just neighbors to the Celts, and that the story of the Saxon invasion was created after the fact for political purposes. So there's this period from like about the 4th to the 8th century or 9th century even, that's called a mini dark age, where all the records just disappear. And there's tons of records before and tons of records after. So because we know that occurred, it's possible that they invented the Anglo-Saxon migration during that period, because as Francis Pryor argues in his Britain AD documentary series, there's absolutely no archaeological evidence to support a massive invasion. There's no known battlefields. There's no like massive. I mean, when you have a battlefield, it leaves archaeological evidence in terms of bodies, in terms of skulls that have been smashed, and wounds, cut marks on limbs and whatever. There has been absolutely nothing that's indicative of battle that would fit the Anglo-Saxon invasion story. People are using this to say, well, the English aren't indigenous anyway, and then then some people take it even further, because the whole Celtic story is every bit as contentious, because there is a theory that the Celts migrated and that there were other people there prior to that, and then there's also theories that no, the Celts did not migrate. They're the indigenous people. But when you're using the term indigenous people, liberals really don't even understand what that even means. If you look to pretty much every single island culture, you find, if you watch documentaries on the history of Japan or read up on it, you find that the Japanese migrated. They weren't indigenous to Japan. But nobody uses that to detract from Japanese culture. Now, if you start looking into Japanese culture, and then you start looking into the Ainu people, are ethnically distinct Japanese population. They have different features, different style of dress, different physical features. So a lot of Far East Asian men can't grow beards, but the Ainu men can grow a full facial thick beard, almost like a Westerner. Their eyes aren't necessarily as almond-shaped as your traditional Japanese or East Asian person. They can have curly hair. But nobody is throwing that in the face of the Japanese, that in ancient times a group of people migrated together and settled a place. But the major difference between that kind of a thing and what's going on right now is that would be an entire community, an entire tribal group of interrelated, ethnically related to one another, extended family or interconnected clan sort of network in a tribal situation in search of land upon which to settle. And this is essentially the story of humankind across the spectrum. There is not a problem with that. The problem occurs when some other group wants your territory. That's where there's a problem. And the natural human reaction is typically, well, it's yours if you can take it from us, and I dare you to try. But the fact that there exist swimmers who can swim across the English Channel at all demonstrates that in the grand scheme of the ocean, the English Channel is not that difficult to get across. So the idea that there wouldn't have been Germanic people and Celtic people going back and forth is just kind of ridiculous, because we know that the Celts and the Germanics lived side by side all over the place in that region. But anyway, if the story as they've passed it down to us is true, and the English did force their way in, so what? That's what humans have done everywhere. And if they took the land under the paradigm of the way human society worked at that point in history, which is the stronger takes the land from the weaker, which is, by the way, a heck of a lot more close to nature than what we're doing right now. Bears, if they have the strength, they will confront other bears, and a battle for territory will ensue. And the strongest takes the territory. You see the same thing with big cats. You see the same thing with flipping stags, fighting over their territory. This is the natural law of the world. So humans behaving in their natural animalistic way of searching for territory, fighting for it, and claiming it is almost animistic in a way, because it is being at one with nature and how nature operates. That is what all animals do. But that's different than what's going on right now. Nobody has rights in a society apart from citizens. Try walking into China as a complete stranger and declaring that you have rights there. Or Korea, whether it's North or South Korea, it doesn't really matter. Even in South Korea, they're not going to just grant you citizenship if you are not ethnic Korean. But as far as I know, now it's been a long time since I've read up on Hawaii. I got, my main interest is Europe, but like everyone else, throughout my life, it's not like we as ethno-nationalists have disdain or hate towards other cultures at all. I think anybody who's a true ethno-nationalist is so because they respect culture and they think culture is a beautiful thing all around the world. Last time I read up on Hawaii, there were certain islands that were smaller islands that were protected in two different ways, either to protect the landscape and the wildlife, but also for the Hawaiian tribal indigenous people themselves, so that your typical outsider or American citizen who's not an indigenous native can't move to some of these smaller islands, as far as I remember. But the Polynesian, so we use this term indigenous Polynesians, but they migrated. I'm not really sure whether we know if there were other people there before them or not. But they did migrate there. The Polynesians left other areas and moved there. So again, human migration is common, but it was never, ever, ever, ever a free. Nobody in their right mind ever would have promoted that or tolerated that. But even when you look to the Maori over in New Zealand, the Maori have their own legends of coming from somewhere else. And the Maori talk about other people who had been there before them, who now, by all accounts, are no longer there. So the Maori either warred with them or just outcompeted them. And so these people who are complaining about the British settlement of New Zealand and Australia don't really have a leg to stand on. But even the Australian Aboriginals, they migrated there. And so if the British also migrated there and they took the land in the way that they did, that is also arguably, again, just human animal nature. That is natural. Going back to the beginning, I was saying when we look over to Japan, aesthetics and just the way it just fits so beautifully between, mankind, the natural world, and the civilization that they have built there. Well, what some of us forget is that East Asians often look at European culture in the same exact way. And that is until they migrate here and embed themselves in our society. Now, when they are in their own culture, from the outside looking in at us, they look to the British Isles with the same sort of wonder and respect that we look to their culture with. So, with that understanding, it's heartbreaking to me that our own people don't recognize what they have and the beauty that resides in their own homelands. But then when you take East Asians and you transplant them here, it's shocking the way that the next generation thinks and behaves. I don't think it has anything to do with their parents, because their parents, first generation Asians, are coming from Asia. They came here because they thought that it was a favorable environment and a beautiful place to live. But their children are then subjected to the conditioning that they're given in liberal educational systems. And so they grow up being indoctrinated to hate the white man and hate our culture and view us as oppressors that let their parents in and welcome them with open arms. It is frustrating because they come here, they come to our countries, and they bitch about the Caucasian standard of beauty as an excuse to disparage the Caucasian features. But lighter skin is something that is universally valued worldwide in like every single culture. We're not forcing them to bleach their skin, but in fact, we wouldn't even want them to. That's what we don't want people to try to turn themselves into something that they're not, no matter who they are. Jessica Simpson looked at that and she just sort of blinked in that little vapid airhead way, and she was like, I just don't understand, because where I live, all the girls go tanning. We want darker skin. The messaging is just so convoluted on all kinds of things when you just open your eyes and look at it. And if you're thinking for yourself instead of just repeating lines over and over again. It goes back to what I just said before. Mass human movement in a tribal situation is completely normal. It's natural. Competition for territory is natural in the animal kingdom, and we are animals too. Individuals moving and the government just saying, come on in, willy-nilly, free for all, that is unnatural. And so when we moved, we did move with our tribe. And in some cases, the land was very sparsely populated. In other cases, we fought and we took it. So what? Tigers do the same thing. Wolves do the same thing. Bears do the same thing. Flipping hell. There's nothing wrong with that. It's natural. Until our lands began to change, so that even as like the foundational stock of this nation, now we don't even fit in, because they're purposefully altering it, and they're purposefully redefining nation to have nothing to do with nativity. And I don't mean capital N nativity, but nativity as in the root of the word natal, nation, native. But no, we have people in our own homelands conditioned to say, just come and take it over, because our connection to this land means absolutely nothing. And nation of immigrants, y'all, nation of immigrants. We were immigrants too. They don't even know what they're saying. But if there are islands off the Big Island where Polynesians are afforded rights and protection, it's imperative that if we understood to do that for someone else, that we would do the same thing for our own people, and that we would carve out land for our own people. So while they're spinning this narrative about the evil whites who conquered other places, the reality is, if that were true, these quote indigenous people wouldn't be here to tell the tale. And in some ways, I'll just be frank with you, we'd be in a much different position with the narrative if we had just said this land is ours, and as our competition, boom, you're gone. We're here now, it's ours. But no, we didn't do that, because we did have compassion. We did have a sense of humanitarianism. And so in North America, whether we're talking America or Canada, these people were given land for themselves, separate from us. And Hawaii affords places for the Polynesians to continue their culture. But any white person who's saying, wait, we have something special too. And we want our own living space. And we want the right to be able to say how we should live and with whom we should live. We're being called horrible names. We're being chided, and they are misrepresenting history and human nature to tell that tale. And all the while, we have people making virtue signaling about the erosion of species on the planet, like the black rhino. Well, your average layperson who looks at a black rhino can't really tell the difference that much between a black rhino and a white rhino. They're both actually kind of gray. And without really being trained, you can't really tell them apart. But yet they are classified as distinct and unique species. Well, I can look at Japanese, and even though their features are a lot closer to Polynesians than maybe mine are, I can still tell the difference between a ethnic Japanese and an ethnic Polynesian person. But we're not classifying them as distinct and special. That's bullshit. They are. and so are we. And certain islands that have a very unique and fragile ecosystem, like the Galapagos Islands, because such unique creatures live there that are different than anywhere else on the planet, those areas are now protected to keep the ecosystem as it is, and so that the species that live there are not made redundant on this earth. They're not, or they're not exterminated. They're preserved in their natural habitat. We in the Folkright community are desperately wanting humanity, westernized humanity who has been indoctrinated by Abrahamism all these years, to wake up and remember that natural life on the planet is no less special and important, or indeed conscious, or spiritual, or even possessing of the divinity, a spiritual essence, than we are as humans. But on the other hand, we need liberals and people who claim to be environmentalists and conservationists and animal welfare advocates who are trying to preserve all of the unique biodiversity on this planet in terms of animal and plant life, to remember that we as an animal indigenous to this planet should not be forgotten. And if we care that the black rhino has gone extinct, and we realize what a tragedy that is on a humane level, on a spiritual level, it's an atrocity, it's a crime against the planet that human activity could have caused the black rhino or any species to become extinct. But it's every bit as egregious of a crime for human biodiversity to be eroded, and the way that we as humans fit into our landscape in the same way that any other animal does. I think it's really important to remember that what makes Great Britain beautiful and distinct and unique is no different than what makes Japan beautiful and distinct. I want to see my people in their natural landscape protected and preserved. British pagans dancing between stone circles is no different than Polynesian grass skirt dances, Hawaiian dances. And, we look at them and we talk about how the spiritual nature and all of their gods are gods of place, landscape, the earth, and also heredity, ancestry. And the same thing with Japan and Shinto culture. It's the same exact thing. We can have communication worldwide with one another. We can travel and we can visit each other. That doesn't mean we should just open the gates and allow the flooding of willy-nilly extreme immigration to lose the beauty of what makes us diverse on this planet. And if we can look at Japan and say, wow, what a beautiful culture, what beautiful art, what beautiful aesthetic, what beautiful people they are. I mean, how offensive would it be to, nope, these buildings that you built, well, they were your ancestors hundreds of years ago. And why would you be proud of that? You didn't do it. Your ancestors did it. And that has nothing to do with you personally. Because that's what they're telling us. And that's horse shit. If we did that to anyone else, well, they wouldn't stand for it. Sad thinking about these things. And I was thinking about how also the children of the mass migration are suffering. The children whose parents bring them to a foreign country where they don't fit in, and they're very conscious that they look different. And they're very conscious that this isn't their ancestral homeland. They don't know who they are, and so they are easily manipulated by the conditioning. And because they are malcontent, because literally they are malcontent, because they are a misfit for this culture, that they do feel angst, and they do feel many feelings that are easily taken advantage of and twisted and perverted and utilized and weaponized against the host culture. So the idea that kids want to conform and fit in is nature. Like with like, that's the law of ethnos. Organisms gathering together who are alike to one another. Not a mixed up, willy-nilly, free-for-all combination. And so when you take a delicate ecosystem like an island environment, and if you flood it with an invasive species always have a drastic detrimental effect on the host environment. Islands are delicate ecosystems, and the humans who have populated them for hundreds to thousands of years are every bit as worthy of protecting as any other creature on this planet. And it's worth pointing out that the Maori of New Zealand only have a history of being there something like 700 or 800 years. So the English have been in Great Britain longer than the Maori have been in New Zealand. And the British settlers who founded America have also been in America almost as long as the Maori have been in New Zealand. So don't give me this horse shit that the Maori have a claim to their land, but my people don't. Oh. But I always leave it on a positive note. So the positive note is that I think, despite all of these negative Nancys who hate themselves and who cheer on the destruction of their own culture, that the awakening spreads every single day, and nobody should forget that. Nobody should forget that the awakening continues to spread, and more people across the Western world are waking up and remembering that they have a right to exist, and remembering that they have a right to homeland, and remembering that, well, more and more white people are seeing through the lies, the slander, the misrepresentations of history, and so on and so forth. I think that it's crucial that white Europeans worldwide connect to natural faith that's rooted in ancestor veneration, that's rooted in the divinity of the landscape. We must return to animism once again, because animism binds us to blood and soil, and bonds us to landscape. This oneness that you see with Japanese culture and their landscape is something that the British have too. And they should be reminded of this, and they should wake up and realize that what they have is valuable and beautiful and important, and they have every right to preserve it every bit as much as the Japanese do.